Our next speaker has not been here for 3 years, but he's one of my favorite people on the planet Earth. He's a physicist, not afraid to think out of the box. Will you please welcome John Daring?
I have to ask the obligatory question. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Try that again.
Okay, how about now? All right. Hey, whose slides are these? Oh, no, just a joke. All right. I'm gonna sum up my opinion of the time limit that we have for the. This, by the way, is supposedly from Lord Nelson, but somebody else said that Goethe did. I don't know who it is. I'm probably going to end up co-opting the thing. But we're going to have to move quickly, and there will be slides that I'm just going to look at and then jump over because I want to get to the salient points. 2 inspirational thoughts. Those of you who know the stories behind these guys, you'll understand what this refers to. Ted Maiman invented the laser, built the world's first working laser, and Gabriel Krohn, I leave that one to those of you who have security clearances to know what that's about. Now, you've heard a little bit about precession and how precession may be related to a binary star motion that our sun participates in. In other words, it's one of 2 stars that are orbiting about each other in some manner. That is the driving mechanism by which this cycle of world ages occurs. But there's a 3rd player in this. And in order to kind of get us comfortable with this, I'm going to, for a moment, forget about our binary companion. Let's just compare us, our solar system, our sun and its family of planets, including the Earth, that we're resting on comfortably right now, to a car. But this car is doomed to basically run around this boring elliptical racetrack. And the idea with this example is that when the car is up at the far end of the racetrack, it gets close to the radio station and the signal reception comes in good. It's a pretty lame example, but I think you get the idea. And as it gets at the opposite end far away, the signal reception gradually fades out. I also had the artist, you'll notice that some of the rocks are kind of scattering the radio waves, and you know how that happens when you're driving out in the country and you get skip and interference. That right there, in literally one second, that's astrology. Astrology has to do with basically, those are like the fixed stars, and they have some influence over us. But the big effect is this. So let's take this example now. And let's say now, instead of just the car with the radio reception, you've got a computer in there. And maybe the timing signal for the computer is actually coming from that radio station. You get far away, the thing's missing pulses, and it starts making mistakes. You get up close, and the computer is now working better. This is equivalent to what I'm going to propose goes on this planet over a long period of time, except that instead of a radio station, it's something else. It's referred to as Vishnu Navi, the Grand Magnetic Center, and I'm going to even speculate about where it may be. Now, the binary orbit is part of the process, 24,000 years. But remember, just going in an orbit isn't going to cause anybody's consciousness to go up or down. The fact that we've heard all this evidence for advanced civilizations, up to and including the understanding of wave mechanics, which is sophisticated physics. It's the sort of stuff that we begin to get back into it like in the late 18th century, 19th century. The idea is something like this. Very simple analogy. We have a generator. There's a magnet. We're running coils by it. And you get an AC signal out. You're all familiar with the fact we have 60 hertz power. Everything in this universe occurs in cycles, where we oscillate between one extreme. The day and the night, the cycle of the month, the year, and this 24,000-year cycle. And in this cycle, in this diagram, basically this represents smart, and down here would be dumb. And so periodically we rise up and down. And the nice thing about this is that if the ancients are correct, we spend over 70% of the time is in the higher ages. But we're not there right now. We're actually just, like about there. And this is why we're going to talk about some things. And I want to also talk very briefly about binary stars. It's interesting, 80% of the stars in our galaxy that we know of, and some people suspect it's higher when you include the brown dwarfs, they're binaries. This got me thinking. I am of the opinion this is not simply because these things are forming and they happen to be gravitationally bound. I think the formation process itself oftentimes leads to binaries. And the simple analogy is, if any of you who are familiar with solitons, which you've all seen, they're these things. The dark spots you see on the bottom of a swimming pool. It took a physicist to get in there with a little bottle of ink and find out these things aren't individual vortices. What's going on up here is you have a little dimple on the surface where there's a whirlpool, and it basically refracts the light away, and you see a dark spot where the sun is bent away. They're actually coupled. Let's go back and take a look at this again. So what you have is you have one and the other, and they're connected by a vortex tube. It's literally like a smoke ring that's been cut in half. There you see the proverbial X, Y, and Z axis, Z going down into the depth of the pool. In higher order electrodynamics, 5-dimensional electrodynamics, it is possible to have what are called vortex knots. And I believe we will eventually find out, probably a long time from now, that stars actually form in a process that involves basically higher order electrodynamics. So consider that we may not just be in a binary system. Binaries form, I think, because that may be the way stars have to form. Now, I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. We've done a lot of work on this at SARA, and at a certain point, I'll probably throw in a few things. The idea basically is something like this, to give you a little bit of a visual. Here's this object that we call the grand center. It's referred to, by the way, the best candidate for this, and I know what immediately this is going to do. I don't want to get into this discussion about UFOs, all right? The best candidate for this is the Pleiades, not some civilization over there. I don't care if there is or isn't some civilization. Every ancient civilization on this planet has got the Pleiades as one of the most revered objects. And they're referred to in the Bible. The Old Testament, in the book of Job, it refers to the, didst thou bind the sweet influence of the Pleiades. So a candidate for this grand center, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but basically the way it goes is, here's the binary orbit that Walter and others have talked about, with our sun and its planets completing this orbit every 24,000 years approximately, and during that time we come in close, remember the radio station, and then we move out. When we're at the point furthest from this, the influence is so diminished, because remember, fields fall off when you get further away, that the consciousness, on average, for the entire planet falls down to a very low level. And when we're at the so-called top of the cycle, or even, on the approach, consciousness is raised. And I think the process is even more complex. I don't think it's just positional. I think it has to do with velocity. Because remember, we're accelerating all the way in. And that sounds an awful lot like an electromagnetic phenomena. Induction is related to velocity. So here, just to give you an idea, basically this would be kind of the way things would be in the golden age. The yellow dot representing our sun, and remember that means our sun plus all its planets, is in close to this influence. And the other object that we orbit about is furthest away from the grand center. Remember, duality always works this way. So now, electromagnetic effects. This is just to give you, I'm going to go through some stuff very quickly here. How would a distant object have this type of effect on human consciousness? Well, Walter said I like to think out of the box. So how about this? Let's talk about this. If we have, first of all, subtle fields, I'd like to be very clear. These may be very weak fields. They may not necessarily be strong in the conventional laboratory sense, but they may be at frequencies or more subtle qualities which match the human nervous system in some way. As some of you know, We just heard this great talk about acoustics. We've done work at SARA both with high-intensity sound for weapon purposes and low-intensity sound for weapon purposes. And we've been able, with pulsed 80 dB white noise at certain frequencies, to induce auditory hallucinations, and it was the creepiest effect. People who were sitting in this chamber, perfectly safe, they all had the same hallucination. They thought they could hear a school ground with kids playing behind them. There was no noise like that, although there was a schoolyard about a half a mile away. Strange thought, huh? So, anyway, so the idea is basically we have all these different things that can stimulate pulse periodic stimulation of the brain, and so I'm going to kind of jump through some of this stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about plants because this is the first place where science actually saw how a cycle, an astrophysical cycle, could basically influence things. In the 1880s, Lemstrom, up in Norway, basically that country, you know, up in Norway, he was looking at how plants were growing, and he found an interesting thing. Their growth was being stimulated during times of high auroral activity. And you know that the aurora are tied to the sunspot cycle, so there's this 11 and 22-year cycle. And he found that what really quite remarkable was that he was able to stimulate or simulate this by building a high voltage grid, putting it over a bed of flowers, a bed of potatoes, various plants, and applying a high voltage to it. And what he was doing was he was trying to simulate the electric currents that are coming up from the ground during high auroral activity. In the very extreme north, there are stories where people have actually seen the ground luminous. You can actually see streamers. It's very, very rare, but there are I think what would be, you know, serious accounts of people who have seen auroral phenomena actually descend to the ground. Well, what he found was that plant growth actually was enhanced even at night by the electric currents that were coming up, and he could greatly stimulate the growth of plants. Bose, not the Bose that many of you know from Bose-Einstein condensates, but Bose, the other great Indian physicist, did a great deal of work. In fact, actually, as some of you know, he probably really ought to be credited with the invention of radio. In 1894, even before Nikola Tesla, he had built a 60 gigahertz, that's millimeter wave, that's really high frequency. I mean, you know, these guys, the rest of the community was working in tens of kilohertz. He built a 60 gigahertz device. He devised waveguides, twist reflectors. And what was he doing? He wasn't interested in radio communication. He was studying basically how plants interact with electromagnetic fields. This is a twist reflector, a quarter wave, basically. We call this a rotator plate if it was optics. What he was doing, though, a deeper purpose was at the base of his work. This was not simply basically because he didn't have anything else to work with. He was interested in how plants responded to electromagnetic fields. And at a time when radio hadn't even really emerged yet, it was still just a theoretical prediction from the electromagnetic equations of Maxwell, he was speculating that plants not only were capable of responding to electromagnetic fields, but that they actually require them. And that therefore optimal electromagnetic conditions, whatever that might be, would bring about optimal development of plants in the nervous system in particular. Now, Nikola Tesla, of course, you know, he's a very controversial guy. There's a lot claimed about him. Some of it, I think, has been exaggerated. I think also some of his greatest work has been completely unappreciated and remains to this day. And I might say by his most ardent supporters. Unfortunately, his biggest fans are oftentimes the most deluded in terms of really understanding his work. But Tesla did a lot of work on bioelectromagnetics, and I'm referring to this older stuff because I want to kind of put this in context. You'll hear about a lot of this now, but the sort of work that Tesla was looking at was, again, very similar to Lemstrom, putting a high voltage grid and finding that plant growth could be greatly accelerated, putting seeds between the poles of a magnet. And this stuff, you know, by the way, this led into, ultimately, his work stimulated a lot of interest in the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, a lot of the agencies, intelligence agencies in our nation began to take seriously these reports that the Russians were playing around with electromagnetic fields for things like mind control and all things like that. But, you know, it is very, very true that this was going on, and there's remarkable work that I'm not able to talk about, really remarkable. I mean, you talk about mystical experiences, there actually are electromagnetic devices, you could say, or conditions that can be set up where you basically have a full-blown, rather surprising experience. Even the guy that developed that horrible musical instrument, the theremin, you know, that thing where you slide your hand up and down and makes all those weird whistling noises, he was kidnapped by the NKVD and taken to Russia during the 1940s to work on electromagnetic weapons. Well, what was really interesting from all this work was they found out the following thing, that at the right frequencies, and typically these were low frequencies, I'm going to come back to that, and very low intensity. In fact, we at SARA, this type of effect can go down to nanotesla if it's at the right frequencies. So we're talking a magnetic field, a Gauss is basically 10,000 Gauss is a Tesla. So basically you're talking about fields which are hundreds of thousands, millions of times below the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field, but at the right frequency, they can have profound effects. Exposure to these can lock up the brain rhythms for 36 hours. Now, if we were to be approaching an object that might be giving off some type of repetitive signal, or it may in fact be a different type of process, but you get the idea. Subtle fields can have profound effects on the way the brain works. And to give an example, which I'm going to jump through pretty quick here, I'm going to mention Persinger's work a little bit. Some of you know that he has published in actually mainstream journals about the luminous phenomena seen up on the Yakima Indian Reservation. There are photographs of this. Again, I don't want to get into the whole UFO controversy, but what he found was that when people got close to these, and he believes that they are natural plasma phenomena that are produced by large electric fields, all of this activity was building up right before Mount St. Helens erupted. The Yakima Reservation is to the east of that. And then it disappeared right after the eruption, as if there had been this electric field that was building up in the area. When people were at a distance, they would see these objects, and it would be like watching ball lightning, just a luminous sphere. But when they got close, their brains started to have all these experiences of paranormal and, you know, seeing entities and things like that. Kind of suggests maybe that it wasn't so much that there were visitors there as perhaps that built into our brain are some very profoundly deep states of consciousness that can be stimulated under the right electromagnetic conditions. Now, I like to concentrate on plants because they're simpler to study, and also because, you know, that little weed that grows in most people's goldfish bowl, that thing has remarkable properties, can be used actually to simulate the human nervous system. You can read about that in Paramahansa Yogananda, the autobiography of yoga. It has a little section, and they're saying maybe someday we can dispense with vivisection of animals. It's a little footnote, because other than the fact that the nerve currents propagate more slowly, that little lowly plant has properties remarkably similar to the human nervous system. In India, there's a tree that's actually used as an antenna. In certain operations, you go hook up an RF amplifier to it, and the thing has very high gain. Now, if it's able to radiate, that means, conversely, since there's a reciprocity relationship that works in electromagnetism, they can also receive. Now, this is a friend of mine in Michigan did this. Basically, where you see these stakes, he's setting up a high voltage grid. This guy got the idea for this. He's not a scientist. He got the idea for this from the Bible. And I'll tell you this story, it's too long, but he noticed a very odd little thing about the Noah's flood. And he said, well, I wonder if the weather conditions or electrical conditions were different at that time. So one half of his garden was irradiated, very simply built a Marksbank high voltage source. And here he has his grandkids basically standing next to them. And here they are, same kid next to the ones that were stimulated with the electricity. This is really remarkable. And by the way, the nutrient levels, and Lemstrom found this in the 1880s, the nutrient levels go way up. Plants are healthier, they're more resistant to insects. So let's kind of quickly summarize this. We have this magnetic center. Now, by the way, let me also explain. This isn't in the ancient texts of India. This was clarified by Swami Sri Yukteswar in his book, The Holy Science. When I say the universal magnetism, I do not mean the kind of magnetism on the refrigerator magnet. This is a very different type of thing. And then we have these two great you can think of this as a generator. Got a big magnet, two conductive windings, that's the sun and our binary star, they're running through. And then we have some way of transforming and storing the power. The Earth itself actually responds perfectly to certain frequencies, and I'm not referring to the Schumann resonances. Those are relatively uninteresting. They have a Q factor of 3 or 4. That means you hit it once, and after 3 or 4 cycles, it damps out. This bound, what they're called xenic surface waves. They're the classical equivalent of surface plasmons. Basically, they're waves of charge density moving through the ground. The Q factor for the planet is at least 2,000. That's a NASA measurement. That means if you excite the planet, it rings electrically for 2,000 cycles. And interestingly enough, it's 12 cycles per second. So isn't that an odd thing that we've actually kind of, for whatever reason, selected a time unit, our unit of time, the second, is essentially 12 cycles for the planet to oscillate. Now, what I think happens is that as our solar system gets brought in its 24,000-year orbit close to this grand center, whatever exactly it is, it's not a common object. I think there's something very unusual. I don't even think it's a black hole or anything, the kind of cliche things. But as it's brought in, our solar system and the planets, they are electrically active. How many of you have heard all these stories lately about all the planets coming to life electrically? Saturn sent out a big burst of X-rays. The probe that went near Mercury finds now one pole spewing out plasma of sodium ions, the other hydrogen ions at the opposite pole. Mars is warming up. What the hell's going on? Pardon my French. We're coming on closer to this. The entire solar system is one big electromagnetic network. If you look at those high Q resonances I was talking about, they literally look, the Earth would look like Jupiter. There's bands of charge that basically ring back and forth from pole to pole being the excitation point. This, by the way, was the basis for how Tesla was going to do radio and power transmission, and we have done that at SARA, and we have a little light bulb with a system that absolutely could not be done in conventional electrodynamics. So wireless power transmission is possible. And those frequencies that our planet responds at, multiples of 12 hertz, some of those the Russians found are really big, and they can produce a big effect on the brain. They produce a very beneficial state of consciousness. They actually produce increased ability on cognitive tests, remarkable effect. So what we'd be saying is we get in close, these waves get excited. So basically, you know, we have, and the planet has many other ways it can resonate. The Schumann resonances are Earth ionosphere modes. The Alphen waves are basically magnetohydrodynamic excitations. In the magnetosphere, you have the Van Allen belts. The Zenit-Sommerfeld waves, I think these are the ones that are most important. The Great Pyramid, the acoustics of the Great Pyramid, SARA modeled this on a three-dimensional transmission line network acoustic thing we have. Whoever built the Great Pyramid designed it to resonate at 11.787 hertz inside. That's the Zenit primary frequency. That is not a coincidence. And that little fluted sort of structure between the big grand gallery and the so-called King's Chamber, it's an acoustic filter that damps out other higher order modes. I think the darn thing was used to set up basically Zenit surface excitation. And I have an idea. Basically, so I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. I assumed, now this is not saying there's a magnetar there. You can read about magnetars in the literature. They're neutron stars with extremely intense magnetic fields, 100 trillion times that of the Earth. But at 10 or 20 light years, or 100 light years, even if it was pulsating at the right frequency, and if the plasma envelope around the Earth could help capture, we literally would have magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields oscillating on this planet if the thing happened to match a 12 hertz resonance, the planetary resonance, particularly in this band where propagation is very good. In other words, we'd ring the whole planet. As we're getting in closer to this object, the planet would basically have you might say, a greater intensity tone that would be stimulating brain activity. Now, this is going way out on a limb, right? This is sawing the tree off, in fact, but it gives you the idea, basically, of what I'm referring to, is you get closer to this thing, whatever this thing is, and it begins to have this impact. Now, I'm going to jump forward here a bit. This, what's that? All right, I'll go back to this one. Now, some intriguing speculations. If we treat this thing similar to magnetism, I know it's not regular magnetism, it's something more subtle, something more, I'll tell you what I think it is in a moment. But let's see some of the effects that we could sort of infer that might happen during this 24,000-year cycle if people and the planet act the same way a piece of material does that's undergoing an AC, time-varying magnetization cycle. So, there are supposedly very long cycles. In the Hindu scriptures, they refer to cycles, and the much longer cycles, well, those are sort of probably where other longer orbital phenomena are also moving us in slowly or closer. So the age actually, sometimes itself is dipping down and then comes back up. The ancient Hindus and Vedic texts refer to timescales that are remarkable. They give the age of the Earth as 4.325 billion years. Right on the money with modern science. Then go out to a bunch of decimal places. So, taking a look at some of these things, what do you think would be magnetic hysteresis? Now, I have a chart that's going to talk about this. This is what happens when you magnetize something and then you take the magnetic field away, or it isn't magnetized and you try and magnetize it. It's like inertia. It basically lags behind, or if it's immersed in a magnetic field and you begin to turn it off, it wants to retain that magnetic field. So it's a little bit out of phase. Well, what that would mean is that what would be the Yuga analogy? Human progress on the upside of the cycle, which we're in now, is going to lag behind. That's why everybody says, we should be further along. And, why is it that everybody's still got these archaic ways of belief? Because this is the inertia, literally electromagnetic inertia of the collective brains of this planet, right? Brains in quotation marks, based on some of the things. So progress appears to lag behind. And on the descending cycle, the opposite would happen. That magnetization that has been basically collectively built into human awareness, the human brain state all magnetized, they're going to hold on to that longer, which might indicate why some cultures retained a reverence for things like sacred traditions and higher knowledge, up until a point where finally it fell so low that they could no longer retain it. So I'm going to tell you here we got a piece of metal. It's being brought in on an elliptical racetrack near an electromagnet. What happens on the physics level, now I'm going to say this is kind of like the way the ages are. Consciousness is low, we get in near the grand center, consciousness comes down as we go away from the grand center. Here's hysteresis. It means that basically the ideal, which is what the actual field that this thing is creating would cause, the level of magnetization, is not really where it's at. It's lagging, and sometimes it even looks like it's leading, depending on what part of the cycle it's in. So that's why I say on the way up, it feels like it really takes a lot to get humans to change, because that inertia, just like mechanical inertia, is there. There's also the Barkhausen effect. If you look at this scale really fine, you'll find that a piece of iron that's being magnetized doesn't just get smoothly magnetized. It happens because the domains, the little grains of magnetic material, one by one, they jump into alignment. And so it has these discontinuous jumps. Well, okay, I'm going to come back to that one. So on a fine scale, it's not smooth, it's little jumpy things. And then what's going on? Also, if this little cycle is the 24,000 years, then there are these longer cycles they call the Maha Yugas, which apparently as we get in closer and further away with some other orbital thing, it basically causes the highest of the point of the highest ages is sometimes higher, and the bottom higher. And then conversely, where we are right now, according to the Vedas, we're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of 3 cycles. So a good analogy is, right now, if high noon is the golden age, we're at about 4:30 or 5 a.m., where you can just look out and go, I think it's getting lighter. That's it. That's where we are right now. So, and by the way, that's for thousands of years, so don't, get like we're not going into the golden age by tomorrow. Well, that Barkhausen effect thing is really interesting because that would mean that progress isn't just smooth, it's going to occur in jumps. So you're going to have sudden changes, economic upheavals, sudden ideas. The 60s was apparently kind of one of those mass events where a bunch of people suddenly came into alignment with a different way of thinking, and it swept through the country. But not every part of the world went through that. You know, they didn't have the summer of love in the Middle East. You know, I mean, so... and finally, I want to just impress on somebody. We really got to take this seriously. This universal magnetism, as Swami Sri Yukteswar talked about it. He said, it is for the present time, and by the way, we've got 2,000 years, 2,100 more years of this Dwapara Yuga. For the present time, it's incomprehensible to us. Not because we're bad people. Our brains literally are not evolved enough yet in our present state to grasp it. And every time I give this talk, somebody comes up and goes, oh, do you think that, it'll be sort of like, that they went to some New Age seminar and somebody put a pyramid hat on their head, and it's like, no. We don't have the comprehension of this yet. So the example I said was, if somebody came up to you and said, explain why the third order nonlinearity and 40 psi xenon gas is suited for stimulated Brouillon scattering, that's SPS, three-wave phase conjugation and aberration correction of a mid-infrared high-energy laser by dynamic hypersound hologram that's generated at the far field zone of the HEL and xenon. That's this age. That's electromagnetic science. That's pretty esoteric stuff, right? All right. We don't have the ability to grasp. That's hard enough to deal with. That's what we're supposed to be concentrating on in this age. The universal magnetism is utterly beyond our comprehension. So it's, I'm not trying to put anybody down, but I don't get it either. Just trust that maybe we have to sometimes accept to be humbled a little bit. And by the way, there are 5 electricities. Now, we talk about 4 forces in physics. I think there's probably a relationship, but in the Hindu scriptures, they say there are 5 electric currents, and we only presently know one of them. And the whole thing with this Dwapara Yuga is to basically learn to manipulate those electric currents, and primarily to make a lot of money with it, because that's what this whole age is about. This is the age of the merchant, the age of people that want to sell. You guys think business is powerful now? Just wait. It's going to be the dominant way of doing things. Where it's going to change is we're going to start having ethics. It's inevitable. Now, because if we don't, basically, so here's a nice picture somebody did for me. The basic notion is it's sort of like a cycle of scales, and I had them exaggerate this. I believe that our galaxy, just like a tornado, big tornadoes have those multiple vortices, it has other centers of rotation which are out near the rim, and these are in playing a role that has to do with the grand electromagnetic structure of the galaxy, which of course is a rotating wave pattern. It's not just a gravity effect that causes that. And you get in a little bit closer where I've kind of sort of expanded on one of these, and you would see maybe something like here I show sort of like a Pleiades star cluster, and here's our sun and its companion star. So we go from 100,000 light years down to 1,000 light years. Pleiades are about 440 light years away, and then maybe over about a 10-year light year distance that's kind of hard to believe, but maybe it is if it is serious, then you have the binary cycle. So there are basically, I suspect, multiple grand centers throughout the galaxy. It's like a mode pattern. Basically, I think there's a flow. Big tornadoes, there's actually a downdraft in the center that flows out, wraps around these suction vortices, and then flows back up. So the galaxy would essentially be something like a tornado. There's probably is the big black hole at the center, and then what these guys are is anybody's guess, but I think they're probably something our physics hasn't quite come on to yet. By the way, I'm going to make a quick comment here, and I'm watching the time. You'd expect, everybody wants to talk about, sort of simple things. All right, how about really going out on a limb? Ancient railroads. I mean, why are we always talking about just the, look at this. Here is what was left in the 1930s of a railway in the United States where they cut the rails and set them into the stone. They actually used stone rails. This was built in 1826. Go across the Yuga to a comparable time. You have the Malta cart tracks. I do not believe, yes, I think they eventually were using carts on these, but that isn't how it started. I've seen a map that the British did before they have all the development on Malta, and there's a Y. And the why is the thing you do with railroads where you take a track like this, and like this to turn a locomotive around. It's something that you only do when you have something that's on a fixed rail system. You don't do it when it's just animal-drawn carts. Also, you look at that, that is a classic turnout for a rail system. And the legends that go back to Malta say, ancient times, that there was boats on wheels that could move over land without the use of sail or animals. So it's kind of an interesting possibility. And I'll jump through some quick stuff here. They're talking now about maybe, well, let's put it this way. Einstein was right, but he was right about a type of physics which we're just now I'm just going to burn through these charts real quick. There are 5 electricities. I think we're very close to cracking this problem at SARA. There's a class of materials called multiferroics. These are very weird media. They have 4 or 5 modes by which energy can be transported through them. I believe, and the parity and symmetry properties match up with our so-called fundamental forces. Again, Gabe Krohn. I read about him. I won't have time to talk about it. This guy is going to shine like a beacon of light. And he walked around the world, by the way, not over the water. He wasn't that good, but I mean, he was a remarkable man. He found Einstein's unified field theory was absolutely the only theory that could describe simple perturbations in electrical machines and networks. And this led basically to the, oh, and by the way, yeah, that's a Krohn quote, which I happen to like. And that was a tribute to Tesla, because that's what Tesla did when he first came to the United States. The greatest experiment. Every age is ushered in. Ours was ushered in, unfortunately, with the incorrect use of nuclear power. It was also ushered in with an experiment that the Navy performed. Our former business advisor was involved in that. This is not anecdotal. It was for real. And because there was an unusual material used in the hull of that ship, they pushed through. Now, why I'm bringing this up is this was the first large-scale manifestation of one of the other electricities, what the Hindus called Vayu, which they said circulates, so that in the hull of that ship, instead of like waves of current moving through, and this isn't just normal electron spin, there are literally quantized vortices that propagate through this. Accidentally, they created a particular material. They wanted to be able to weld the ships together more easily. Banish-Hoffman said Krohn's work basically had led to validation of Einstein's unified field theory. What's that got to do with the yugas? It predicts 5 electric-type modes that are responsible for the 4 forces that we see, and a 5th one which we don't know about yet. It also, interestingly enough, the vector magnetic potential, which some people believe is real, that's through the Aronoff-Bohm experiments, seems to link to consciousness. Perhaps that grand center that is this source of universal magnetism, the term might be unified field. It is the raw, undifferentiated field from which our 5 forces come from. Here are Chautin's original equations showing that the electromagnetic field is really just vortex excitations in space-time. Here's the man himself. This is a copy of his book we have at SARA that he autographed. This guy, read about him, absolutely. Tesla and Einstein combined in one human being, and he was a really, really funny, decent human guy. He was, not one of these wackos. New Age electromagnetism. This is what we've used to do transmission of power without wires. It really does work. We blew out a phone network a mile away. Military is kind of interesting. And I've also done some other stuff. There are predictions that electromagnetism and gravity would link together. And as you know, SARA has, and I think that's there we go. We did an experiment very quickly. I'll finish this up. We did an experiment with a very, very, very carefully done. This thing was world-class, isolated from the Earth's magnetic field vibration, electric field, and we found, yes, according to Einstein's unified field theory, there was a slight gravity effect. That, by the way, is not what you're seeing here. That's a Helmholtz coil to take out the local magnetic field. So what does that mean? Well, that Einstein unified field theory changes gravity. Gravity no longer has a simple potential it falls off. It has these kind of bumps, and in fact, It turns out the solar system, the planets, form exactly at the nodes where this thing would be predicted to collect. This is a revolutionary view of gravity, and I think it might explain how our sun could be bound to a star as far away as Sirius. It's not the type of Newtonian or even general relativity. Einstein said general relativity is wrong. Unified field theory, which very few people are aware of. We've been doing work at SARA to basically model this. It is related to light, interestingly enough, a rate of change of the Poynting's vector. And let's see. Oh, yeah, this device. This may take a while to load in here. This was one of the things that we built, and I don't know where the photo is, but I guess so. There's supposed to be a photo that pops in. Oh, there it is. All right, that's nice. Basically, that's a transmission line using mercury. We saw very, very, very weird effects with that when it was tuned so that the EM field pumping it matched those resonant modes of the Earth. Funny stuff happened, and this thing was incapable of resonating, particularly low frequencies. Some of you have heard about this. This was basically, to just be blunt, we did an experiment that showed we generated lift with rotating electromagnetic field. That was the team that did that. They're all former test engineers from Northrop. They said, John, you're crazy. I still am, but they agreed. We're getting something here. It was a remarkable experiment. Finally, just some quick things. Sound waves. Remarkable how sound interplays. It is actually, believe it or not, one of the electricities. Phonons. This is actually a galaxy-like structure made by a guy named Hans Jenny. He excited a plate with talcum powder on it. Each one of those things is rotating around and forming this pattern. Other electricities like spin transport through materials, we're starting to get close to them. I think these 5 electricities that Sri Yukteswar talked about are buried in here. I'm quite sure the plasmon is one of them. These are collective electron waves. The magnon is a wave of magnetization. In other words, what does this mean? It means there are other currents that have different types of fields associated with them. And what they say is that one of those currents has, as its magnetic field, the field it produces when the charge is flowing, is gravity. When we harness that, which is what we were trying to do, we did see a gravity effect. Finally, I'm going to basically just end real quickly. We're entering the atomic age. It is, I think, inexcusable that we still have so much suffering in the world. You want to know where a lot of this anger and hatred comes from. Despite what they say on talk radio, it really does have to do with poverty and a lack of equitable distribution. The only way we're going to get around that is we have to have energy. Energy, I think, is going to be the commodity of exchange in the future. Get over this fear of atomic power. It's the very thing that runs our sun. So basically, I want to harness the power of the sun. I'm a big proponent for fusion, and there are versions that produce no radioactivity, can't be used for weapons. They go directly from nuclear to electric. That is basically all I've got. So thank you for that. And I'll be